was 9 years old, sitting in a pew too hard for a boy that age, when Sister first told us about Thomas. Doubting Thomas. That's the whole story you got, right? The disciple who wouldn't believe until he could put his fingers in the wounds. Every Sunday school class in every parish for 2,000 years has taught the same lesson. Thomas doubted, Thomas touched, Thomas believed. Case closed. Turn the page. Everybody knows that story. And here's the thing about a story you've heard so many times, you stop actually looking at it. You stop noticing the parts that don't fit. Because there is a word attached to Thomas's name in the oldest Greek manuscripts we have. A word that shows up 4 separate times in the Gospel of John alone, sitting right there in plain sight. And in 2,000 years of sermons, almost nobody ever stops to ask what it actually means. It means twin, not a nickname, not a personality trait. A twin. And once you ask the obvious next question, twin of who? The tidy little story of doubting Thomas stops looking like the ending of something. It starts looking like the cover page of a file somebody spent 16 centuries trying to keep sealed shut. Here's the first crack. And it isn't hiding in some banned book. The investigator J.J. Bennett has spent a career chasing exactly this kind of silence, the place where an official text goes suspiciously quiet right when the story is about to get interesting. This is one of those places. It's sitting in the version of the Bible that's on your nightstand right now, translated, approved, and printed by mainstream publishers for centuries. Open the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 16. Thomas is introduced not just as Thomas, but as, quote, Thomas called Didymos. The same wording shows up again in chapter 20, verse 24, and again in chapter 21, verse 2. 3 separate times, the writer of the 4th Gospel goes out of his way to attach a second name to Thomas. And 3 separate times, he never once explains why. Think about how strange that actually is. If I told you a story and kept calling a character by 2 names back to back, Thomas called Didymos, Thomas called Didymos, and never once told you what the second name meant or why it mattered, you would assume I forgot to finish a sentence somewhere. Bible translators didn't forget. They just left the original word standing there in Greek, untranslated like a locked door in the middle of a hallway everybody just learned to walk past. Didymos is Greek. It means twin. And Thomas itself isn't actually a first name at all. It's a transliteration of the Aramaic word toma, which means the exact same thing. Twin. Which means if you translate both halves of his name honestly, instead of leaving one in transliterated Greek and mistaking the other for a surname, the New Testament is technically calling this man twin, the twin, not once, in 2 different languages, stacked directly on top of each other, like the text itself couldn't stop repeating the one detail somebody, somewhere down the line, decided you didn't need to know. So read that verse again with fresh eyes. Thomas called Didymos doesn't mean Thomas, nicknamed Didymos. It means twin, called twin. The Gospel of John, the most theologically careful, most tightly argued book in the entire New Testament, introduces one of the 12 apostles by calling him the twin, in 2 languages, back to back, and then just moves on like that is a totally normal thing to do to a supporting character. It isn't. Nobody gets called the twin twice unless the detail actually matters to somebody. And here's what should stop you cold. The canonical Bible, the one sitting in every church pew, never tells you who Thomas was supposedly the twin of. That question is left hanging in the exact same book that is supposed to have all the answers. No other apostle in the entire New Testament carries a title like this one. Peter is called the Rock. James and John are called the Sons of Thunder. But only one man walks through the Gospels dragging a second name that translates, in 2 separate ancient languages, to the exact same unanswered question. And the title didn't die with the Gospels. Centuries later, Christian communities across ancient Persia, and eventually across the Malabar coast of India, would trace their entire founding story back to this same man, calling their churches by his name and insisting against every effort by later missionaries to correct them. that the apostle who reached their shores was already known among his own people as the twin before he ever left Judea. An entire branch of world Christianity, thousands of miles from Jerusalem, built its founding memory around a title the West spent centuries pretending was just an unusual nickname. That's not a wild theory some documentary invented last year. That's a gap sitting in plain Greek text for almost 2,000 years, and it's been sitting there long enough that most pastors read right past it without blinking. So that's the first layer peeled back. Thomas wasn't just a doubter with a curious nickname. He was walking around the Gospels with a title stamped on him in 2 ancient languages, a title that means twin. And somehow that detail got lost in translation for 2,000 years running. But that isn't the uncomfortable part yet. That's just the crack in the wall. What's on the other side of it is a lot harder to explain away. None of this made it into any classroom I ever stood in front of. I spent years teaching this exact gospel to a room full of teenagers, walking them through the doubt of Thomas every single year, semester after semester, and it never once occurred to me to ask what Didymos meant. Not once. I could diagram that chapter blindfolded, and I never saw the door standing open right in the middle of it. In December of 1945, in the desert near a town called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging in the dirt at the base of a cliff, looking for a soft, nitrate-rich soil he used as fertilizer for his fields. His mattock hit something hard, not a rock, clay. He dug around it and found a sealed red earthenware jar, nearly as tall as his own chest, buried at the base of a boulder. And for a long moment, he later said he didn't want to open it. In the stories he'd grown up with, jars like that, buried alone in the desert, didn't hold treasure. They held jinn, spirits, sealed up by someone who knew exactly what they were keeping in. He broke it open anyway. Inside were 13 leather-bound books made of papyrus, wrapped and preserved by the dry desert air for roughly 1,600 years. Nobody standing in that desert that afternoon understood what they were looking at. In fact, before scholars ever got their hands on the full collection, several of those papyrus pages had already been torn apart and burned as kindling in a clay oven, so a family with no idea what they held could bake their bread that week. What was left after that didn't even reach scholars cleanly. Pages were sold piecemeal on the antiquities black market in Cairo over the following years, passed from dealer to dealer, split apart from books they had been bound with for 16 centuries. One entire codex ended up purchased in Europe and quietly held by a research institute in Zurich for years before anyone connected it back to the jar in the desert. And it took scholars decades of patient, often adversarial work just to reassemble something close to the original 13 books, page by scattered page. The discovery of the century very nearly became kindling and pocket money instead. It took an international team of translators the better part of 3 decades, working file by file, dialect by dialect, before a complete English edition of all 13 codices finally reached the general public in the 1970s. Which means for almost 2 full generations after that jar came out of the ground, the words you're about to hear existed only in specialist journals and university libraries, effectively as sealed to ordinary readers as they had been sitting in the sand. What survived is now called the Nag Hammadi Library, and buried inside Codex II, one of those 13 books, are 2 texts that do something the canonical Gospels never quite dare to do. They finish the sentence the Gospel of John left hanging. The first is called the Gospel of Thomas. It opens with a line that early Coptic scribes copied by hand, generation after generation, hiding it in a jar rather than let it be destroyed. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Not Thomas the doubter. Didymus Judas Thomas, the twin Judas Thomas, 3 names stacked on top of each other, and the first one, again, is twin. The second text goes even further. It's called the Book of Thomas the Contender, and in it, Jesus turns to Thomas directly and says something that never made it anywhere near a church pulpit. Now, Since it has been said that you are my twin and true companion, examine yourself and learn who you are. Read that again. Not implied, not hinted at through a title lost in translation, stated outright, in the voice of Jesus, addressed to Thomas by name. You are my twin. And notice what Jesus tells him to do with that information. Not worship, not obey. Examine yourself and learn who you are. In a religious tradition that would spend the next 2,000 years telling ordinary believers to look outward, toward an altar, toward an institution, toward a hierarchy of men in robes who claimed sole authority to interpret the divine. Here is a text where the instruction runs the opposite direction entirely. Know yourself, because you already carry the resemblance. That is not a comfortable instruction for any organization whose entire business model depends on believers needing someone else to tell them who they are. Now, does that mean Thomas was Jesus' identical biological twin brother, delivered in the same birth? Or does it mean something more spiritual, a twin soul, a mirror, a title of intimacy rather than biology? Even scholars who have spent entire careers on these texts don't fully agree. And I'm not going to pretend the answer is simple. But here is what is simple. This was not some obscure fringe idea invented by conspiracy blogs in the last 20 years. It was written down in the 3rd and 4th centuries, in the same religious world that produced the Gospels you already know, and it was preserved carefully enough that someone thought it was worth sealing in a jar and burying rather than burning outright. Which raises a much harder question than what does twin mean. It raises the question of why. Here's what makes that suppression even stranger. The New Testament itself, without any embarrassment at all, tells you Jesus had brothers. Mark's Gospel lists them by name: James, Joses, Judas, and Simon, sitting right there in chapter 6. Paul, writing decades before any Gospel was compiled, refers matter-of-factly to meeting, quote, James, the Lord's brother. Nobody buried those verses. Nobody transliterated brother into some untranslated Greek word and hoped nobody would ask questions. Ordinary siblings were never the problem. The Bible was comfortable enough with Jesus having brothers that it printed the family roster in plain language and moved on, so brother wasn't the forbidden word. Twin was. An ordinary younger brother poses no threat to the idea of a singular, unrepeatable savior. He's simply family, a supporting character in someone else's story. A twin is a different category of problem entirely. A twin implies simultaneity. Two versions of the same face, born at the same hour, walking the same roads, indistinguishable enough that entire households, according to what we're about to look at, could not reliably tell them apart. You can build a religion around one irreplaceable son. It is much harder to build one around two identical men standing in the same room, and only one of them gets called divine. In her landmark analysis of these documents, the historian Elaine Pagels laid out exactly what was at stake. The Nag Hammadi texts weren't suppressed because they were obviously fake, cobbled together by nobody in particular. They were suppressed because if Thomas really was Jesus' twin, spiritually, symbolically, physically, take your pick, it cracked open a foundation the early institutional church had built everything else on top of. A single, unique, irreplaceable Son of God doesn't leave room for a twin. Cannot leave room for a twin. The moment you allow a twin into the story, you allow a second version of Jesus into the world, and an institution built entirely around the singularity of one man cannot survive that kind of company. So Orthodox bishops didn't just quietly lose interest in these texts. Councils across the 4th and 5th centuries actively labeled writings like these heresy, ordered them destroyed, and in some documented cases pressured monasteries to burn their own libraries to comply. Which means the jar in the desert wasn't an accident of history. Somebody at a monastery near Nag Hammadi almost certainly buried those 13 books on purpose, hiding them from their own church, betting that the desert would keep them safer than the men who were supposed to be their custodians. Sit with that for a second. The very people responsible for preserving the story of Jesus were, at the same time, actively hunting down and destroying the parts of that story they couldn't control. And one of the pieces they wanted gone most badly was the word twin, sitting 3 inches from his name. So the second layer isn't just a curious word anymore. It's a controlled substance, an idea real enough, threatening enough, that grown men in positions of enormous power spent centuries making sure you would never read it in the original. But here is where it gets uncomfortable. Because everything so far, Didymos, twin, and true companion, could still technically be explained away as symbolism. A poetic title. A spiritual metaphor for closeness with Christ, nothing more. The next text doesn't leave you that exit. 3rd century. A different manuscript tradition entirely, not Egyptian and Coptic this time, but Syriac, coming out of the ancient Christian community centered in Edessa, a city with some of the oldest continuous Christian worship on record. The text is called the Acts of Thomas, and it does something that should genuinely unsettle you. It doesn't just call Thomas Jesus' twin as a title of honor, it describes people mistaking one for the other, not once as a passing joke. Repeatedly, across multiple scenes, in a way the writer clearly expects the reader to find remarkable rather than strange. In one episode, a bride and groom mistake Thomas for Jesus after Jesus himself has already left the room, addressing him as though he were still standing there. In another, the household of a king reacts to Thomas as though they already know his face, because, the text implies, they do. Even demons in the narrative are said to recognize the resemblance and hesitate before it. Buried inside that same Syriac tradition is a poem called the Hymn of the Pearl, and once you know the twin tradition surrounding Thomas, the poem reads less like decoration and more like confession. It tells of a prince sent from his father's house into a foreign country to retrieve a pearl guarded by a serpent. Once there, he eats the food of that country and forgets who he is, forgets he is a prince at all, until a letter arrives from home reminding him of his true identity, and only then does he wake, remember himself, and return home wearing a robe that turns out to be an exact mirror of his own reflection. Scholars still argue over exactly who wrote it and when, but it was preserved in the same manuscript tradition that insists Thomas and Jesus wore, in some sense, the same face. A forgotten prince. A robe that is also a mirror. A message from home that restores a lost identity. Whether that poem was written about Thomas specifically or not, it was copied and guarded for centuries by people who clearly believed the deepest kind of truth was recognizing your own reflection standing in front of you, not being told about it secondhand by an intermediary standing between you and God. Now you can argue, and plenty of careful scholars do, that Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas were using twin the way a mystic uses the word reflection. A spiritual doubling, not a biological one. That argument holds up fine against the Gospel of Thomas alone. It does not hold up against the Acts of Thomas, a text that describes actual human beings, actual households, actual bystanders confusing one man's face for another man's face, is not describing a metaphor. It is describing a resemblance close enough to fool eyewitnesses standing a few feet away. And before you write this off as some late fantasy dreamed up centuries after the fact, understand what modern manuscript analysis has actually established. The Coptic texts pulled out of that jar in the desert are translations. The Greek originals behind them are dated by scholars to somewhere between the middle of the 1st century and the early 2nd, which puts at least some of this material as old as, or older than, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John as we have them. This isn't a late invention patched onto an old story after the fact. This is a competing strand of the story that existed at the same time the canonical version was still being written down, running in parallel the entire time until one strand got printed in 1 billion Bibles and the other got sealed in a jar and buried in sand. And the physical tradition didn't stay contained in one manuscript either. The same communities who preserved the Acts of Thomas also preserved a much larger legend. that this same twin carried the message east, past Persia, all the way to the Malabar coast of India, where Christian communities still living today trace their founding back to his hands, centuries before any European missionary ever set foot on that coast. Ask the descendants of those communities who founded their church, and they will not say a nameless apostle. They will say Thomas, the one who looked like the Lord. The title followed him across 3,000 miles and 2,000 years, long after Western Christianity had quietly stopped repeating it out loud. So, walk all the way back now, to that pew, to the story about a doubter who touched a wound and believed. Case closed, turn the page. That was the whole story I was handed as a boy, and it's the whole story I handed to a room full of teenagers, year after year, standing at the front of a classroom without ever once asking why the Gospel of John kept calling this particular disciple by a name that means twin. Here is what I understand now that I didn't understand then. Doubting Thomas isn't a full character. It's a redaction. It's the version of Thomas that survives when you take a man reportedly said to be Jesus' twin, a man some early Christians believed you could mistake for Jesus if you passed him on the street, and you shrink him down until the only trait left is that once he asked for proof. A skeptic with a party trick is safe. A twin who could pass for the Messiah in a crowded room is not. One of those men fits neatly inside a religion built on the uniqueness of a single savior. The other one breaks it. So the institution kept the skeptic and buried the twin and called the whole operation faithful preservation of Scripture. And it wasn't only theologians doing the work of forgetting. Painters did it too. Walk into nearly any major museum with a Renaissance or Baroque religious wing, and you will eventually find some version of the same scene. Thomas, finger extended, pressed directly into the wound in Christ's side, disciples crowding around in a mixture of horror and awe. Caravaggio painted it. So did dozens of artists before and after him. For 400 years, the single most reproduced image of this man shows him in the exact posture the institution needed him in, physically separate from Jesus, visibly doubting, visibly subordinate, his entire identity narrowed down to the moment he needed proof. Not one of those canvases hangs in a museum showing two identical faces in the same room. The culture didn't just inherit the redacted story, it kept repainting it, generation after generation, until the redaction became the only image most people could even picture when they heard his name. I remember the exact night I understood that. Years after I had walked out of that classroom for good, long after I had stopped being the man standing at the front of the room with the answer key, I sat at my kitchen table with a translation of Codex II open in front of me, reading the words, "You are my twin and true companion," for what felt like the 10th time in a row. And the thing that hit me wasn't the words themselves. It was the years. All those years I had spent teaching the doubt of Thomas as though it were the whole story, never once curious about a Greek word sitting 3 inches from his name on the page. I wasn't lied to by one bad sermon. I was handed an incomplete file and told it was complete, by people who had every reason to make sure it stayed that way, and I taught that incomplete file to hundreds of students without ever checking the seal. Everything I just walked you through, the Greek grammar in John, the Coptic text of Codex II, the Syriac account of 2 identical faces mistaken for each other in the same room, none of it lives only in a documentary script. It's real manuscript material, and I keep a running library of primary sources like this, sourced and cross-checked line by line, pinned in the comment below this video, for anyone who wants to go further than a video like this one can take you. Here's what I want you to sit with, long after this video ends. It isn't really about Thomas. It's about every story you've ever been handed as the finished version of the truth. Think about your own life for a second. The version of your family history that gets repeated at every holiday dinner, smoothed out, missing the parts nobody wants to explain. The version of a breakup, or a falling out with a friend, or a decision your parents made that got simplified down into a single clean sentence because the real story was too complicated to tell a child or too uncomfortable to tell yourself. Almost everyone is carrying around at least one doubting Thomas version of their own life, an edited file, handed to you early, that you accepted because nobody around you ever cracked it open and asked why certain details were missing. That's what happened with Thomas. Not a lie, exactly. A redaction? Someone decided the safe version of the story was more useful than the complete one, and the safe version got copied so many times, in so many churches, for so many centuries, that it stopped feeling like an edit at all. It just felt like the truth. Maybe it's the real reason a marriage ended, softened down for the kids into gentler words. Maybe it's a diagnosis a parent received and decided the family didn't need the full weight of, so you got the version with the sharp edges filed off. Maybe it's simply the reason you were the one sent away to live with a relative for a summer, a reason that got repeated so many times in its edited form that even you started to believe the edited version was simply what happened. None of that makes anyone a liar. It makes them human, protecting themselves or protecting you the only way they knew how, the same way a 4th century bishop protected an institution the only way he knew how. But protection and truth are not the same thing, and mistaking one for the other for long enough eventually costs you the ability to tell them apart. There's likely a version of this in your own history that you've never gone looking for, not because you couldn't find it, but because some part of you has always suspected what you would find and decided the tidy version was easier to live inside. That's not weakness. That's what an edited file is designed to do. It is built, deliberately or not, to feel complete enough that going back and checking the seal seems unnecessary, maybe even disloyal. Somebody trusted you with the short version. Asking for the long one can feel like an accusation. But here's the thing, nobody tells you about sealed jars. They don't stay buried by accident. Somebody decided at some point that the desert was safer than the truth walking around in daylight. And every one of those decisions, whether it was made by a 4th century bishop signing off on which manuscripts got burned, or by someone in your own family deciding which parts of a story you were old enough to hear, was made by a person weighing what they thought you could handle against what actually happened. Sometimes they were right to wait. Sometimes they were simply protecting themselves and calling it protecting you. The only way to know which one it was is to eventually go back and open the jar yourself. The problem was never that people asked too many questions about Thomas. It's that most of us were handed a file someone else had already decided was finished. And once you see that pattern in one place, a 2,000-year-old text, a jar in the desert, a word nobody bothered to translate, you start noticing it everywhere else too. In the neat version of your own history, in the story your family tells about itself, in the parts of your own beliefs you inherited instead of examined. The next time somebody hands you the tidy, case-closed version of anything, it might be worth asking the same question I never thought to ask in that classroom for years. What word exactly did they leave untranslated? If any of this cracked something open for you, the subscribe button is what tells YouTube to keep bringing you these layers instead of burying them the way certain institutions have historically preferred. There is a lot more sealed in these jars than one video can cover, and I am not done opening them. Tell me the moment you first realized you had been taught only half a story about Thomas or about anything else. I would like to know I am not the only one who taught the sealed version for years without ever checking the seal.